The dust stung Sarah Jane's eyes as she knelt in the dirt outside the general store, scrubbing the wooden steps with a worn brush that had lost half its bristles 3 months ago. But she kept her gaze fixed downward because looking up meant seeing the pity in people's eyes, and that hurt worse than any bruise her uncle had ever given her. It was the spring of 1878 in Willits, California, a small timber town nestled in the valley where the redwoods grew so tall they seemed to touch heaven itself. Sarah had arrived here 6 months ago after her parents died in a fire back in Missouri, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a letter directing her to the only family she had left, an uncle she had never met. Robert Jenkins had taken her in, but not out of kindness. He owned the general store and the boarding house above it, and Sarah quickly learned that her place in his household was somewhere between servant and prisoner. She was 19 years old, though most days she felt ancient. Her brown hair hung in a simple braid down her back, always covered with a faded bonnet that had belonged to someone else. Her dress was patched in so many places it was hard to tell what the original fabric had been. She kept herself small, quiet, invisible. When customers came into the store, she helped them without meeting their eyes. When her uncle barked orders, she obeyed without question. When the other young women in town whispered and laughed as they passed her on the street, she pretended not to hear. The brush scraped against the wood in a rhythm that had become as familiar as breathing. Back and forth, removing the mud and grime that accumulated from countless boots tramping in and out of the store. Her hands were red and raw, her knees aching against the hard planks, but she did not stop. Her uncle had told her to finish before noon, and the sun was already high overhead. "Child looks half-starved," she heard someone murmur as they stepped over her. Sarah scrubbed harder, as if she could erase herself along with the dirt. She did not see the massive shadow that fell across the steps until a pair of worn leather boots appeared directly in her line of vision. They were different from the townspeople's boots, rougher and more weathered, with mud caked in the treads that spoke of mountain trails rather than city streets. She automatically shifted to the side to let the person pass, but the boots did not move. "You work here." The voice was deep and rough, like stones tumbling in a river. Sarah kept her eyes on the steps. "Yes, sir. Just let me move so you can get by." "I am not trying to get by." She paused in her scrubbing, confused. Most people either ignored her completely or barked orders. No one just stood there talking to her. "Can I help you find something inside, sir?" she asked quietly, still not looking up. There was a long moment of silence. Then the voice said, "Why do you not look at people when they talk to you?" The question caught her so off guard that she almost did look up, but years of learned behavior kept her gaze fixed firmly on those worn boots. "I am sorry, sir. I did not mean to be rude. I will get my uncle to help you." "That is not what I asked." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she clutched the brush. She did not know how to answer. The truth was too complicated, too painful. It was easier to just keep her head down and hope people left her alone. When she did not respond, the man made a sound that might have been frustration or concern. She could not tell which. Then, to her absolute shock, he crouched down right there on the steps, bringing himself to her level. She could see more of him now, though she still did not raise her eyes past his torso. He was enormous, with arms thick as tree trunks and a chest that seemed impossibly broad beneath his worn flannel shirt. His hands, resting on his knees, were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who worked hard for everything he had. "My name is Patrick Irwin," he said, his tone gentler than before. "I live up in the mountains about 10 miles north of here. I came down to get supplies, but I am not going into that store until you tell me your name and look at me when you do it." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. She did not understand what was happening. Why did this stranger care whether she looked at him or not? Why was he still crouching there on the steps, patient as stone, waiting for her to do something she had trained herself never to do? "Sarah Jane Jenkins," she whispered. "And I cannot, sir. I am sorry, but I cannot. Cannot or will not. Cannot." The word came out choked. "Please, you are going to get me in trouble. My uncle will be angry if he sees me talking to customers instead of working." "Then I suppose he will be angry," Patrick said, unmoved, "because I am not moving until you look at me, Sarah Jane Jenkins." Panic fluttered in her chest. Her uncle would be furious if he looked out and saw her sitting here talking instead of finishing the steps. But this mountain man seemed completely serious about not moving, and she could not just leave the steps half-finished either. She was trapped. Her hands twisted the brush until she thought it might snap. "Why does it matter to you?" The words burst out before she could stop them, more emotion in her voice than she had allowed herself in months. "Why do you care if some nobody looks at you or not?" "Because there is no such thing as a nobody," Patrick said simply. "And because something tells me you have forgotten that." The kindness in his voice nearly broke something inside her. She was not used to kindness. She was used to orders and criticism and long silences that felt like punishment. This stranger's gentle insistence felt dangerous, like it might crack open the careful shell she had built around herself. Slowly, so slowly it felt like moving through honey, Sarah raised her head. Her gaze traveled up past his chest, past his broad shoulders, past the dark beard that covered the lower half of his face, until finally she was looking into his eyes. They were gray, the color of storm clouds, but there was warmth in them that she had not expected. His face was weathered and tanned from years in the sun, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than he frowned. His hair was dark brown and fell past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord. He was perhaps 26 or 27, she guessed, and he was looking at her like she was a person worth looking at. The intensity of his gaze made her want to look away again immediately, but she forced herself to hold it for one breath, then two, then three. "There," Patrick said, and she thought she saw approval in his expression. That was not so hard, was it? Actually, it had been terrifying, but Sarah did not say that. She just stared at him, unsure what was supposed to happen next. Patrick rose to his full height, which seemed to go on forever. He had to be over 6 feet tall, built like the mountains he came from, all muscle and raw strength. Yet he moved with a careful deliberation, as if he was aware of his size and trying not to be intimidating. "I am going inside now to get my supplies," he said. "When I come back out, I expect you to be finished with those steps and taking a break in the shade with some water. Do you understand?" Sarah blinked at him. "Sir, I cannot. My uncle said I had to finish before noon, and then I have to reorganize the stockroom and—" "Sarah Jane," Patrick interrupted, and there was steel beneath the gentleness now. "When I come back out, you will be in the shade with water. This is not a suggestion." Before she could protest further, he stepped over her and disappeared into the store. Sarah sat frozen on the steps, her mind reeling. Who was this man? Why had he talked to her like that, like he had some right to tell her what to do? And why, despite her confusion and anxiety, did some tiny part of her want to do exactly what he said? The sound of her uncle's raised voice drifted out from the store, barking orders at someone inside. The familiar sound jolted Sarah back into action. She attacked the remaining steps with renewed vigor, scrubbing until her arms ached and the wood gleamed. She had just wrung out her brush for the final time when Patrick emerged from the store, carrying a heavy canvas pack filled with supplies. He stopped when he saw her still kneeling there, and his jaw tightened. Without a word, he set down his pack, walked to the rain barrel at the corner of the building and filled a tin cup with water. Then he came back, took Sarah firmly but gently by the elbow, and guided her to her feet. Her legs had gone stiff from kneeling so long, and she stumbled slightly. His hand steadied her immediately, warm and strong through the thin fabric of her sleeve. Patrick led her to the narrow strip of shade on the side of the building and pressed the cup into her hands. "Drink," he commanded. Sarah drank. The water was cool and sweet, and she had not realized how thirsty she was until it hit her tongue. She drained the cup in several long swallows, then stood there awkwardly, holding the empty cup and wondering what was expected of her now. "When did you last eat?" Patrick asked, studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "I had breakfast, sir." "What did you eat?" Sarah hesitated. The truth was she had eaten some bread crusts left over from yesterday, but that seemed too pathetic to admit. "Enough," she said instead. Patrick's expression suggested he did not believe her, but he did not push the issue. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out a wrapped bundle. He opened it to reveal thick slices of dried meat and some kind of dense bread. He broke off a piece of each and held them out to her. "I cannot take your food, sir," Sarah protested. "Patrick," he corrected. "And yes, you can, because I am giving it to you." When she still did not reach for it, he sighed. "Sarah Jane, I have plenty. I hunt and trap for a living. I will not starve because I shared some jerky with you. Now take it before I decide to hand feed you like a baby bird." The absurd image that conjured startled a laugh out of her, small and rusty from disuse, but a laugh nonetheless. The sound seemed to surprise both of them. Sarah clapped her hand over her mouth, but Patrick was grinning at her like she had done something wonderful rather than something foolish. "There," he said with satisfaction. "I knew you could smile. Now eat." This time Sarah took the food. The meat was tough and required serious chewing, but it was seasoned with salt and herbs and tasted better than anything she had eaten in weeks. The bread was hearty and filled her empty stomach with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. She ate slowly, trying to make it last, very aware of Patrick watching her the entire time. "Your uncle," he said after a while, "he treats you poorly." It was not a question, but Sarah shook her head anyway. "He gives me a place to live. I should be grateful." Gratitude and being treated like a human being are not mutually exclusive. Patrick leaned against the building, crossing his arms over his chest. "How long have you been here?" "6 months." "And in those 6 months, has he paid you wages for your work?" Sarah blinked. The question had never even occurred to her. "I work for my room and board." "Does your room have a real bed? Do you get 3 full meals a day? Are you allowed to have time to yourself, to rest, to go into town for reasons other than work?" Each question landed like a small stone in still water, creating ripples that Sarah did not want to examine. "He is my family," she said quietly. "He took me in when I had nowhere else to go." Patrick was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was careful. "Family does not mean you owe someone your dignity, Sarah Jane." The words settled into her chest, heavy and uncomfortable. She wanted to argue, to defend the situation she had found herself in, but deep down she knew he was right. She knew that the way her uncle treated her, the way he spoke to her like she was less than nothing, the way he worked her from dawn until late into the night with barely enough food to keep her going, was wrong. But knowing something was wrong and having the power to change it were two very different things. "I should get back to work," she said, handing him back the empty cup. "Thank you for the food and the water." Patrick took the cup but caught her hand before she could pull away. His hand dwarfed hers, rough and warm, and he held it gently, like it was something precious. "I am going to come back next week," he said. "And the week after that, and the week after that. Every time I come to town, I am going to check on you. Do you understand?" Sarah's throat tightened. "Why?" Because someone should. He released her hand slowly. Because I looked into your eyes today, and I saw someone who has forgotten she matters. And I have decided I am going to keep reminding you until you remember. Before Sarah could form a response to that extraordinary statement, Patrick picked up his pack, settled it on his shoulders, and walked away. She watched him go, this strange mountain man who had appeared out of nowhere, and upended her carefully maintained invisibility in the space of a single conversation. He moved with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in his own skin, and people stepped aside to let him pass without him having to ask. Sarah touched her chin unconsciously, remembering how he had crouched down to her level rather than forcing her to crane her neck upward. How he had looked at her like she was worth looking at. How he had commanded her to take care of herself with the absolute certainty that she deserved to be cared for. No one had treated her like that in a very long time. Maybe ever. Sarah Jane. Her uncle's voice cracked through the air like a whip. "Where are you? Those shelves are not going to stock themselves." Sarah hurried back inside, but something had shifted. For the first time in 6 months, she found herself counting down the days until someone returned. The thought carried her through the rest of that long afternoon and into the evening, a small warm coal of anticipation glowing in the center of her chest. 7 days later, Patrick returned. Sarah was sweeping the front porch when she saw him coming down the main street, and her heart did a strange little jump in her chest. She told herself it was just surprise, nothing more, but she could not quite make herself believe it. He came straight to her, and this time when he spoke, she made herself look up at him without being asked. The approval in his eyes made her feel like she had accomplished something monumental. "Hello, Sarah Jane," he said. "Hello, Patrick," she replied, and was rewarded with one of his rare smiles. "Have you eaten today?" Yes, it was true. Her uncle had been in an unusually good mood that morning and had actually given her a full bowl of porridge for breakfast. Patrick studied her face as if trying to determine whether she was telling the truth, then nodded slowly. "Good. I brought you something." He reached into his pack and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. When he handed it to her, Sarah unwrapped it carefully to reveal a smooth river stone, oval-shaped and pale gray with a white line running through it like a vein. "It is from the creek near my cabin," Patrick explained. "I was checking my traps yesterday and saw it. It reminded me of you." Sarah stared at the stone, completely at a loss. "Why?" "Because it is stronger than it looks. It has survived being tumbled by water and weather for who knows how long, and instead of being broken, it has been made smooth. Beautiful." He paused. "Keep it in your pocket. When things get hard, hold on to it and remember that you are stronger than you think." Sarah's vision blurred with sudden tears. She blinked them back furiously, not wanting to cry in front of this man who had shown her more kindness in 2 brief encounters than most people had shown her in a lifetime. "Thank you," she managed. "You are welcome." Patrick's expression was gentle. "Now show me you still remember how to look people in the eye. Go ahead, look at me." She did, holding his gaze even though every instinct screamed at her to look away. His gray eyes were steady and calm, and looking into them felt like looking at something solid and permanent, like the mountains themselves. "Good girl," he said quietly. "I am proud of you." Those words, simple as they were, struck something deep inside her. When was the last time someone had said they were proud of her? When was the last time she had done anything worth being proud of? But Patrick stood there looking at her like she had just slayed a dragon, and Sarah felt something long dormant stir in her chest. Hope, maybe. Or the memory of what it felt like to be valued. Over the following weeks, Patrick came to town every 7 days, regular as clockwork. Sarah found herself living for those visits, though she would have died before admitting it. Each time he brought her something small, a feather from a hawk, a piece of honeycomb wrapped in leaves, a carving of a bear he had made during the long evenings in his cabin. He never stayed long, just enough time to make sure she was eating, to coax her into looking up and meeting his eyes, to remind her in a dozen small ways that she existed and mattered. And slowly, incrementally, Sarah began to change. It started with small things. She stopped hunching her shoulders quite so much. When customers spoke to her in the store, she made herself meet their eyes for a moment before looking away. She took slightly bigger portions of food when her uncle was not looking, and she did not feel quite so guilty about it. The stone Patrick had given her lived in her pocket, and she touched it constantly, drawing strength from its smooth surface. Her uncle noticed the changes and did not like them. He had always preferred Sarah docile and compliant, and this new spark of something in her made him uneasy. He started finding more ways to criticize her work, to remind her of her place in his household. But his words did not cut quite as deep as they once had, because every 7 days Patrick returned and rebuilt what her uncle tried to tear down. It was late summer when things came to a head. Sarah was in the stockroom organizing crates of goods that had just arrived by wagon when she heard her uncle talking to someone in the store. She was not trying to eavesdrop, but the walls were thin and his voice carried. "She is 19, healthy enough despite looking half-starved, and she can work hard," her uncle was saying. "I think $50 is a fair price." Sarah froze, her hand still gripping the crate she had been moving. "A fair price? For what?" "I do not know, Jenkins," another man's voice replied. This one she recognized as Horace Pemberton, a cattle rancher from a spread about 15 miles outside of town. He was nearly 50 years old, a widower with a reputation for going through hired hands quickly because of his harsh treatment. "She is awfully scrawny, and she does not talk much. I need a wife who can pull her weight." The world tilted sideways. Sarah's uncle was trying to sell her to Horace Pemberton as a wife. "She will fatten up once she is getting regular meals," her uncle said dismissively. "And the fact that she does not talk much should be a benefit, not a drawback. No nagging, no complaining. She will do what she is told and be grateful for it. Honestly, Pemberton, you will not find a more biddable woman in the whole territory." "I suppose you are right," Horace said thoughtfully. "And my ranch could use a woman's touch." "All right, Jenkins, $50. I will come by next week with the money and a preacher, and we will get it done official." "Excellent. I will make sure she is ready." Sarah's hands were shaking so hard she had to set down the crate before she dropped it. Her mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. She could run, but where would she go? She had no money, no family besides her uncle, no one who would help her. She could refuse to marry Horace, but her uncle was her legal guardian until she turned 21, and he had the right to arrange her marriage if he chose. She was trapped, completely and utterly trapped, unless the thought came to her suddenly, desperately. Patrick. Patrick had told her he would check on her, that he would keep coming back. His next visit was in 3 days. If she could just avoid her uncle until then, if she could get a message to Patrick somehow, maybe he would help her. It was a thin hope, but it was the only one she had. For the next 3 days, Sarah moved through the house like a ghost, trying to be invisible again, trying not to draw attention to herself. Her uncle watched her with a calculating expression, and she knew he was trying to decide when to tell her about the marriage arrangement. He was probably waiting until the last possible moment, knowing she would have no time to protest or plan. Patrick arrived on schedule, and Sarah felt like she could breathe again for the first time in days. She was sweeping the porch when he came up the steps, and the moment his eyes met hers, his expression changed. "What happened?" he asked immediately, setting down his pack and moving closer. Sarah Jane, what is wrong? She glanced nervously at the store windows. Her uncle was inside dealing with another customer, but he could look out at any moment. I need to talk to you, she whispered urgently. But not here. Can you meet me tonight, after dark? Patrick's jaw tightened and something dangerous flashed in his eyes. Where? There is a barn behind the boarding house. I will wait for you there after midnight. He looked like he wanted to press for more information, but something in her expression must have convinced him to wait. I will be there, he promised. But Sarah Jane, if you are in danger, if someone has hurt you, midnight, she interrupted, because she could see her uncle starting to turn toward the window. I have to go. Patrick caught her hand, squeezed it once hard, and then let her go. She slipped back inside, her heart pounding. The rest of the day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah forced herself to act normal, to do her chores, to respond to her uncle's occasional comments with quiet compliance. But inside, her mind was racing. What would she say to Patrick? What could she even ask him to do? He was just one man. He could not fight the law, could not override her uncle's authority as her guardian. But she had to try. She had to at least tell someone what was happening. That night, Sarah lay in her tiny attic room, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Her uncle went to bed around 10, as he always did, and within an hour she could hear his snoring rumbling through the walls. She waited another hour to be safe, then slipped out of bed, still fully dressed beneath her nightgown. She removed the nightgown, put on her bonnet, and crept down the stairs on bare feet, avoiding the boards she knew creaked. The barn was really just a large shed where her uncle kept the wagon and some overflow inventory from the store. It smelled of hay and old wood and mouse droppings. Sarah had brought a candle, but she did not dare light it yet, so she stood in the darkness and waited, her arms wrapped around herself, shivering despite the warmth of the summer night. She did not have to wait long. The barn door opened silently, and Patrick's massive silhouette filled the doorway. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, and suddenly the space felt much smaller. I am here, Sarah whispered. There was a scratch and a flare of light as Patrick struck a match and lit a small lantern he had brought with him. In the warm glow, his face looked stern and worried. Tell me what is happening, he said without preamble, and do not leave anything out. So Sarah told him. The words came tumbling out in a desperate rush. She told him about overhearing her uncle's conversation with Horace Pemberton, about the arranged marriage, about how trapped she felt. As she spoke, she watched Patrick's expression grow darker and darker, until his eyes looked like storm clouds about to break. When she finished, there was a long moment of silence. Patrick stood very still, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and Sarah could practically feel the anger radiating off him. When? He finally asked, his voice carefully controlled. Next week. Horace is bringing the money and a preacher. Over my dead body, Patrick said flatly. Sarah's heart leaped at the fierce protectiveness in his tone, but she forced herself to be practical. Patrick, you cannot stop it. My uncle is my legal guardian. He has the right to arrange my marriage. No one has the right to sell another human being like livestock, Patrick growled. Guardian or not, this is wrong, and I will not stand by and let it happen. What can you do? Sarah asked helplessly. You cannot just kidnap me. That would make you a criminal. Then I will marry you myself. The words hung in the air between them, stunning in their simplicity. Sarah stared at him, unable to process what he had just said. What? Patrick took a step closer, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. Marry me, Sarah Jane. Today, tomorrow, as soon as we can find a preacher. If you are married to me, your uncle cannot force you to marry Pemberton. Patrick, that is crazy, Sarah said, even as her heart pounded wildly in her chest. "You barely know me. You cannot want to marry me just to save me from an arranged marriage. Can I not?" He moved closer still, until he was standing right in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head back to look at him. "Sarah Jane, I have been coming to this town every week for months now, and every time I leave, I spend the next 7 days thinking about when I can come back. I look forward to seeing your face, to hearing your voice, to watching you slowly remember that you are worth something. Do you truly think I would do all that for someone I did not care about?" Sarah's throat was tight. "You feel sorry for me." "I feel protective of you," Patrick corrected. "There is a difference. Yes, I hate seeing you treated poorly. Yes, I want to shield you from people who would hurt you. But Sarah Jane, if all I felt was pity, I would have found you a job somewhere else in town and been done with it. I keep coming back because I want to, because you matter to me." "Why?" The question came out as barely a whisper. Patrick lifted his hand slowly, giving her plenty of time to move away if she wanted to. When she did not, he gently touched her chin with his calloused fingers and tilted her face up, just like that first day on the steps. "Because when I look at you, I see someone strong and brave and good. I see someone who has been beaten down by life but has not broken. I see someone worth fighting for." His thumb brushed along her jaw, the touch feather light. "And somewhere along the way, I stopped being able to imagine my life without you in it." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks before she could stop them. "I do not want to trap you into a marriage you do not want. You are not trapping me, I am offering." Patrick's expression softened. "I know this is sudden. I know I am not much. I live in a cabin in the mountains, miles from the nearest town. I spend my days hunting and trapping and living rough. I cannot offer you fancy dresses or a big house or anything close to luxury. But I can offer you safety, respect, a life where you never have to hang your head again, where you can look people in the eye and know that you are valued. And I can offer you a husband who will spend every day trying to be worthy of you." Sarah could barely see him through her tears. Everything in her life had taught her to be cautious, to expect the worst, to believe that no one would ever truly want her. But Patrick stood before her, this mountain of a man with gentle eyes and rough hands, offering her a way out. More than that, offering her a future that included kindness and respect and maybe, eventually, something more. "I do not know how to be a wife," she said tremulously. "I do not know how to be a husband," Patrick replied. "We will figure it out together. What if you regret it? What if you wake up one day and realize you made a terrible mistake? Not possible." He said it with such absolute certainty that Sarah almost believed him. She took a shaky breath, trying to think through the overwhelming rush of emotion. "If we do this, my uncle will be furious." He was counting on that $50 from Horace. Let him be furious. Once you are my wife, he has no claim on you anymore. Patrick's expression hardened. "And if he tries to cause trouble, he will have to go through me, which I do not recommend." Despite everything, Sarah felt a smile tug at her lips. The image of her uncle trying to intimidate Patrick was almost funny. Robert Jenkins was not a small man, but compared to Patrick, he might as well be a child. "I will need my things," she said slowly, and realized as she said it that she was agreeing. She was actually agreeing to marry this man she had known for only a few months, to leave everything she knew and go live in a cabin in the mountains with him. It was insane. It was reckless. It was quite possibly the bravest thing she had ever done. "We will get your things," Patrick promised. "Is there much?" "No. Everything I own fits in one small bag." The statement should have been sad, but somehow it felt liberating. She had so little tying her to this place, to this life. It would be easy to leave it behind. "Good. Can you be ready tomorrow night? We will need to travel to the next town over to find a preacher who will not ask too many questions and to make sure word does not get back to your uncle before it is done." Sarah nodded, her heart racing. "Tomorrow night." "I will be ready." Patrick smiled at her, and the warmth in that smile made her feel like the sun had come out after a long winter. "Then tomorrow night you become Mrs. Irwin." He paused. "If that is what you want, Sarah Jane, I need to hear you say it. I need to know you are choosing this, not just running away from something worse." She looked up at him, at this man who had spent months teaching her to lift her chin and see her own worth, who had brought her gifts and food and kindness when he owed her nothing, who was now offering her his name, his protection, and his life with no expectation of anything in return. "I choose this," she said clearly, holding his gaze. "I choose you, Patrick Irwin." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise over the mountains. "Then I am the luckiest man in California," he said simply. They spent a few more minutes working out the details. Patrick would return the next night with his horse. Sarah would pack her few belongings and wait in the barn. They would ride through the night to a town called Ukiah, about 30 miles south, where Patrick knew a preacher who owed him a favor. They would marry there and then head north to Patrick's cabin in the mountains. When Patrick finally left, slipping out of the barn and disappearing into the darkness, Sarah sat down on a bale of hay and tried to process everything that had just happened. In less than 24 hours, her entire life was going to change. She would go from being Sarah Jane Jenkins, unwanted niece and unpaid servant, to Sarah Jane Irwin, wife of a mountain man, living a life she could barely imagine. The thought terrified her. It also filled her with a fizzing excitement that made it impossible to sleep when she crept back to her room. She lay in her narrow bed, clutching the smooth river stone Patrick had given her weeks ago, and imagined what tomorrow would bring. The next day was the longest of Sarah's life. She went through her chores mechanically, her mind elsewhere. Her uncle commented twice on her distraction, and she forced herself to focus before he grew suspicious. In the late afternoon, she pleaded a headache and retreated to her room early. Her uncle barely grunted in response, more interested in counting the money in his cash box than in her well-being. Once in her room, Sarah pulled out her only bag, really just a worn carpet bag that had belonged to her mother. She packed her 2 spare dresses, her extra set of undergarments, her hairbrush, and the few small mementos she had left from her parents, a tin locket with their picture inside and her mother's Bible. It took less than 10 minutes to gather everything she owned in the world. She tucked Patrick's gifts, the stone, the feather, the carving, carefully into the bag as well, wrapping them in a spare chemise so they would not break. Then she waited. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. She heard her uncle go to bed, heard his snoring start up. She waited an extra hour to be absolutely certain he was deeply asleep, then changed into her sturdiest dress and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. She picked up her bag, took one last look around the tiny attic room that had been her prison for 6 months, and crept down the stairs for the final time. Patrick was already waiting in the barn, his massive horse saddled and ready. When he saw her, he crossed the space in 2 long strides and took her bag from her hands, securing it behind his saddle. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Sarah looked back at the dark shape of the building that housed her uncle's store and boarding house. She felt no regret at leaving it, no sadness. Just relief, bright and buoyant, filling her chest. "Yes," she said. "I am ready." Patrick swung up into the saddle with easy grace, then reached down and pulled Sarah up behind him as if she weighed nothing. She had never ridden a horse before, and she grabbed onto his waist instinctively, her arms wrapping tight around his solid frame. "Hold on," Patrick said, And then they were moving, the horses' hooves quiet on the dirt as they left Willits behind. They rode through the night, following roads that turned into trails that wound through forests of towering redwoods. Sarah clung to Patrick's back, her face pressed against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of leather and pine and something uniquely him. The motion of the horse beneath them became almost hypnotic, and she found herself relaxing into it, trusting Patrick to know where they were going. Dawn was breaking when they finally reached Ukiah. It was larger than Willits, with a proper main street lined with buildings. Patrick guided his horse to a small white church at the edge of town and helped Sarah dismount. Her legs were shaky after hours of riding, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow until she found her balance. "Wait here," he said. "I will find Preacher Matthews and see if he can perform the ceremony now." Sarah waited on the church steps, watching the town come to life around her. People were starting to emerge from their homes, beginning their daily routines. She wondered what they saw when they looked at her, a rumpled young woman sitting alone on the church steps in the early morning light. She wondered if any of them could guess that in a few minutes, if all went well, she would be married. Patrick returned with an older man in tow, thin and gray-haired with kind eyes magnified by wire-rimmed spectacles. "Miss Jenkins," the preacher said, taking Sarah's hand. "Patrick tells me you wish to be married this morning, under some rather unusual circumstances." Sarah glanced at Patrick, who gave her a reassuring nod. "Yes, sir," she said, "if you are willing." Preacher Matthews studied her face for a long moment, then looked at Patrick. "I have known Patrick Irwin for 5 years now. He is a good man, honest and hardworking. He once saved my son from drowning in a river, but I will not perform this ceremony if the young lady is being coerced in any way." "She is not," Patrick said firmly. "Tell him, Sarah Jane." Sarah met the preacher's eyes directly, using the skill Patrick had taught her. "I am here of my own free will, Preacher Matthews. I am choosing to marry Patrick. No one is forcing me." The preacher seemed satisfied with that. "Very well then, let us go inside." The ceremony was simple and quick, performed in the empty church with only Preacher Matthews's wife pulled from their home to serve as a witness. Sarah and Patrick stood before the altar, and the preacher read from his Bible in a voice that echoed in the quiet space. When he asked Patrick if he took Sarah Jane Jenkins to be his lawfully wedded wife, Patrick's "I do" was strong and clear. When he asked Sarah the same question, her voice shook slightly, but the words were sincere. "I do." Patrick produced a simple gold band from his pocket, clearly purchased at some point during his trips to town in preparation for this moment. He slid it onto Sarah's finger, and it was a little loose but not enough to fall off. She stared at it, this physical symbol of the commitment they had just made, and felt the weight of it settle over her like a blanket. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Preacher Matthews said with a smile. "Patrick, you may kiss your bride." Sarah's heart stuttered. In the rush of planning and fleeing and traveling through the night, she had somehow not thought about this part. She looked up at Patrick, suddenly nervous, and found him watching her with an expression that was tender and patient. "May I?" he asked quietly, and she appreciated that he was asking, giving her a choice even now. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Patrick cupped her face gently in his large hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones, and lowered his head slowly until his lips met hers. The kiss was soft and brief, a whisper of contact that sent warmth flooding through her body. When he pulled back, his eyes were warm and he was smiling. "Hello, wife," he murmured. "Hello, husband," Sarah whispered back and felt a giggle bubble up unexpectedly. She clapped her hand over her mouth, embarrassed. But Patrick just laughed and pulled her into a hug that lifted her feet off the ground. They thanked Preacher Matthews, Patrick paid him for his services, and then they were back on the horse, heading north this time toward the mountains and Patrick's home. Sarah was exhausted from the sleepless night and the emotional upheaval, and she dozed against Patrick's back as they traveled, trusting him to keep her safe. The sun was past its peak when Patrick finally guided his horse off the main trail onto a narrower path that wound upward through thick forest. The air grew cooler and fresher the higher they climbed, heavy with the scent of pine and cedar. They followed a creek that burbled and splashed over rocks, and Sarah could hear birds singing in the trees above them. Finally, they emerged into a clearing, and Sarah saw Patrick's cabin for the first time. It was solidly built from logs, larger than she had expected, with a stone chimney and real glass windows. A small corral to one side held 2 goats, and there was a vegetable garden growing strong and green near the front door. It looked like a home, not just a shelter, and Sarah felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. Patrick dismounted and helped her down, then led his horse to a small barn behind the cabin to unsaddle and tend to the animal. Sarah stood in the clearing, looking around at what was now her home. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way. The mountains rose up behind the cabin, their peaks still holding patches of snow even in late summer. The forest surrounded them on all sides, thick and green and alive with the sounds of creatures she could not see. Patrick emerged from the barn and came to stand beside her. "What do you think?" he asked, and there was a note of uncertainty in his voice that she had never heard before. "It is beautiful," Sarah said honestly. "I have never seen anywhere so lovely." Relief flashed across Patrick's face. "Come inside. You must be exhausted." The interior of the cabin was neat and surprisingly comfortable. There was a main room with a large stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, and a bed in one corner covered with furs and quilts. A door led to what looked like a small storage room. Everything was clean and well-maintained, and Sarah revised her assumptions about mountain men living in squalor. Patrick watched her take it all in. "I know it is not fancy," he began, but Sarah cut him off. "It is perfect." And it was. Not because it was luxurious or impressive, but because it was warm and safe and so completely different from the cold, unwelcoming space she had occupied in her uncle's boarding house. "Are you hungry?" Patrick asked. "I can make us something to eat." Sarah realized she was starving. She had been too nervous to eat properly the day before, and they had not stopped during their night ride. "Yes, please." Patrick moved around the kitchen area with easy competence, pulling out bread and cheese and some smoked fish, assembling a simple meal that he set out on the table. They ate together in comfortable silence, and Sarah marveled at how natural this felt, sitting here with this man who was now her husband, sharing a meal in their home. After they ate, Patrick showed her around the rest of the property. The small barn where he kept his horse and stored his hay. The smokehouse where he preserved meat. The creek that provided fresh water. He explained how he made his living trapping animals for their pelts, which he sold in town, supplemented by hunting for meat and growing what vegetables he could in the short mountain growing season. It was a hard life, he acknowledged, but it was honest work, and he was his own master. As the day faded into evening, exhaustion finally caught up with Sarah. She had been running on nerves and determination for so long that now, safe and settled, her body demanded rest. She must have swayed on her feet because Patrick was suddenly there, steadying her. "You need to sleep," he said gently. "Come on." He led her inside and over to the bed, and Sarah's nervousness came rushing back. She was married now. This was her wedding night. There were expectations, things that were supposed to happen between a husband and wife, but Patrick seemed to read the sudden tension in her body because he stopped and turned to face her. "Sarah Jane," he said quietly, "I know this has all happened very fast. I know you are exhausted and probably overwhelmed. I am not going to. That is, I want you to know that nothing has to happen tonight that you are not ready for." He ran a hand through his long hair, looking unusually flustered. "What I am trying to say is that I will sleep in the barn. You take the bed. Get some rest. We have all the time in the world to figure everything else out." The kindness and consideration in his words made Sarah's eyes burn with tears. "Patrick, this is your home. I cannot take your bed and make you sleep in the barn. You are not making me do anything. I am offering. The bed is big enough for 2 people," Sarah said slowly, her cheeks heating. "We are married, we can share it. I need time before." "I understand." Patrick's expression was warm and reassuring. "And I am in no rush. Like I said, we have all the time in the world." That night, they lay down together in Patrick's bed for the first time as husband and wife. Patrick had given her one of his clean shirts to sleep in, and it hung on her like a tent, falling almost to her knees. He stayed on top of the blankets while she burrowed underneath, and he kept a careful distance between them, not crowding her. But Sarah found herself grateful for his presence, for the sound of his steady breathing and the warmth he radiated. "Patrick," she whispered into the darkness. "Yes." "Thank you for everything." There was a pause, then she felt his hand find hers under the blankets, his fingers threading through hers and squeezing gently. "You do not need to thank me, Sarah Jane. This is what family does. What husbands do, we take care of each other. Family." The word settled into her heart like a benediction. She had not had family, real family, in so long. But lying here in the darkness, holding this man's hand, Sarah thought maybe she was finally home. The days that followed fell into an easy rhythm. Sarah woke each morning to find Patrick already up, tending to the animals and checking his trap lines. She took over the cooking and the cleaning, tasks that felt different here than they had in her uncle's house, because she was doing them for her own home, for her own husband. Patrick never demanded or criticized. He thanked her for every meal, complimented her when she figured out how to make decent biscuits from the limited supplies they had, and praised her when she successfully mended a tear in his shirt. Slowly, carefully, they learned each other. Sarah discovered that Patrick was quieter than he seemed, content to go hours without speaking when he was working on a task. That he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. That he sang to himself when he thought no one was listening, old ballads in a surprisingly good baritone. That he was endlessly patient with her questions about this new life, teaching her how to tell which plants were edible, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to move quietly through the forest. Patrick discovered that Sarah was smarter than her lack of education would suggest, quick to learn and adapt. That she had a gift for growing things, making his vegetable garden flourish under her care. That she hummed while she worked, probably without realizing it, soft melodies that made the cabin feel like a home. That she was braver than she knew, facing this completely foreign way of life without complaint. And gradually, the careful distance they had maintained in the bed at night began to shrink. It started with Sarah waking to find herself curled against Patrick's side, drawn to his warmth in her sleep. Then Patrick began to pull her close deliberately, his arm wrapped around her waist, keeping her safe through the night. Then one evening, sitting by the fire after dinner, Patrick reached out and pulled Sarah into his lap, and she went willingly, resting her head on his broad shoulder while they watched the flames together. "I think I am falling in love with you," Patrick said quietly, his lips against her hair. Sarah's heart skipped. "Just falling?" she asked, because over these weeks she had discovered her own courage, found her own voice. Patrick pulled back enough to look at her, and the warmth in his eyes made her breath catch. Perhaps I have already fallen, he admitted. I think I started falling that very first day, watching you scrub those steps with your head down, and wanting nothing more than to make you look up and see yourself the way I saw you. And how did you see me? Sarah whispered. As someone extraordinary, Patrick said simply. Someone worth crossing mountains for, someone I would be proud to spend my life beside. Sarah reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his beard, the angle of his jaw. I am not falling, she said, and watched confusion flicker across his features. I have already fallen. Completely. I love you, Patrick Irwin. The kiss that followed was nothing like the chaste brush of lips at their wedding. This was deep and searching, full of all the feeling they had been carefully holding back. Patrick's hands came up to cradle her face like she was something precious, and Sarah pressed closer, wanting to eliminate any distance between them. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Patrick rested his forehead against hers. Sarah Jane, he murmured, may I make you my wife in truth? Not because it is expected or required, but because I love you and want to show you just how much. Yes, Sarah breathed. Yes, please. Patrick stood, lifting her easily in his arms, and carried her to their bed. That night, he made love to her with a gentleness and reverence that made her feel cherished beyond measure. And Sarah, who had spent so long believing herself worthless, finally understood what it meant to be valued, to be wanted, to be loved. Summer faded into autumn, and the mountains transformed into a riot of gold and orange and red. Patrick taught Sarah how to preserve the garden's harvest for winter, how to smoke meat and store root vegetables, and make the supplies they had stretch as far as possible. He took her with him on his trap line sometimes, teaching her to move quietly through the forest, to read animal tracks, to understand the mountain's rhythms. Sarah continued to blossom under Patrick's steady care and affection. The perpetually hunched shoulders straightened. The hesitant, downcast eyes learned to look directly at the world. The quiet, fearful voice grew stronger and more confident. She laughed more easily, spoke her mind without fear, and moved through their cabin and the surrounding woods with the assurance of someone who finally felt like she belonged. One crisp October morning, Patrick came back from checking his traps with news. I need to make a trip to Willits, he said. Winter is coming, and there are some supplies we will need that I cannot make or get any other way. Flour, salt, some other staples. Sarah felt her stomach clench with anxiety. She had not been back to Willits since their wedding, had not seen her uncle or dealt with any of the fallout from her sudden departure. Do you think he is still angry? She asked quietly. Patrick came to her and took her hands in his. I am sure he is. But Sarah Jane, you are legally my wife now. He has no claim on you, and I will not let anyone hurt you or make you feel small ever again. You have my word on that. I believe you, Sarah said, and she did. When do we leave? Patrick raised an eyebrow. I was planning to go alone. The trip down the mountain can be rough, and I am coming with you, Sarah interrupted firmly. Patrick, I cannot hide up here forever, and I think I need to face him, to show him and myself that I am not the scared girl who scrubbed his steps anymore. Pride shone in Patrick's eyes. All right then, he said. We will go together. They made the trip on horseback, taking 2 days to travel the distance that had taken only one when they were fleeing in urgency months ago. They camped one night under the stars, and Sarah lay wrapped in Patrick's arms, feeling safer than she ever had under a roof in her uncle's house. When they rode into Willits on a bright autumn afternoon, people stopped and stared. Sarah sat tall behind Patrick, her arms around his waist, and met their curious gazes directly. Let them look. Let them see that she had survived, that she had found a life beyond this small town's boundaries. They tied the horse outside the general store, and Sarah felt her heart begin to pound. Patrick squeezed her hand once, then pushed open the door. The bell above it chimed, just like it always had. Robert Jenkins looked up from behind the counter and his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, recognition, and then rage. "You," he snarled, glaring at Sarah. "You ungrateful little wretch. Do you have any idea what you cost me? Pemberton was furious when you disappeared. I had to refund his $50 and listen to him rant about how I could not control my own kin." Sarah felt Patrick tense beside her, but she stepped forward before he could speak. "I am sorry you lost your money, Uncle Robert," she said, and her voice was steady and calm. "But I am not sorry I left. You were going to sell me to a man I did not know like I was a piece of property. That was wrong. Wrong." Her uncle's face was turning red. "I took you in when you had nowhere else to go. I fed you and gave you a roof over your head. You owed me." "I worked for you every day for 6 months," Sarah countered. "I cleaned your store, organized your inventory, cooked and cleaned, and did everything you asked without complaint. That was more than enough repayment for a room in your attic and whatever scraps you gave me to eat. Why, you little—" Her uncle started to come around the counter, his hand raised, and Patrick moved like lightning. Suddenly, he was between Sarah and her uncle, and the difference in their sizes was almost comical. Patrick did not raise his voice, did not make threats. He simply stood there, arms crossed over his massive chest, and the message was clear. To get to Sarah, her uncle would have to go through him first. Robert Jenkins stopped, his hand still raised, and some of the bluster went out of him. Up close, facing the full reality of Patrick's size and strength, even her uncle was not fool enough to start a physical fight. "She is my niece," he tried, but it sounded weak. "She is supposed to obey me. She is my wife," Patrick said quietly, dangerously. "Which means she does not answer to you anymore, Jenkins. Sarah Jane came here today as a courtesy, to face you with her head held high so you could see what you lost when you treated her like she was worthless. Now we are going to buy our supplies, and then we are going to leave, and you are going to let us go without another word. Do you understand?" The two men stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, Robert Jenkins looked away. "Fine," he muttered, "but do not expect any family favors on the prices." "I would not dream of it," Patrick said dryly. They purchased what they needed, Patrick paying in cash for every item while Sarah stood beside him, her hand firmly clasped in his. The whole transaction was conducted in stiff, cold silence. When they were done, Patrick loaded their supplies into saddlebags, then helped Sarah onto the horse. Before they left, Sarah looked down at her uncle one last time. "Goodbye, Uncle Robert," she said. "I hope you find someone else to do your work, someone you will treat better than you treated me." Then they rode away, and Sarah did not look back. As they left the town behind, climbing back up into the mountains, Sarah felt something lift from her shoulders. She had faced her past, had stood up to the man who had made her feel so small, and she had survived. More than that, she had thrived. She was not that scared, quiet girl anymore. She was Sarah Jane Irwin, wife of a mountain man, a woman who knew her own worth. "I am proud of you," Patrick said over his shoulder as they rode. "What you did back there took courage." Sarah leaned forward and pressed a kiss to his shoulder. "You gave me that courage," she said. "You taught me to look up, to see myself differently. I could not have done this without you." "Yes, you could have," Patrick said firmly. "The strength was always in you, Sarah Jane. I just helped you remember it was there." Winter came to the mountains with a vengeance that year. Snow fell deep and heavy, transforming the world into a wonderland of white. The cabin became a warm cocoon where Sarah and Patrick weathered the storms together, reading by firelight, cooking meals that filled the small space with delicious smells, and making love under piles of furs and quilts while the wind howled outside. It was during one of these long winter nights that Sarah realized she was pregnant. Her courses had not come for 2 months, and she was queasy in the mornings, though she tried to hide it from Patrick. But he noticed everything about her, and one morning when she rushed outside to be sick in the snow, he was right behind her, holding her hair back and rubbing her back with gentle hands. "How long?" he asked quietly when she was finished. "I think maybe 2 months," Sarah admitted. "I was going to tell you, I just wanted to be sure." Patrick helped her back inside and settled her in a chair by the fire, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Then he knelt in front of her and took her hands. "Are you happy about this?" he asked, his gray eyes searching her face. "I know we have only been married a few months. This might be sooner than you wanted." Sarah looked at this man who had saved her in every way that mattered, who had shown her what love really looked like, and felt her heart overflow. "I am happy," she said, smiling through sudden tears. "I am so happy, Patrick. We are going to have a baby." The smile that broke across Patrick's face was like the sun coming out after a storm. He pulled her into his arms, careful of her queasy stomach, and held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "A baby," he murmured into her hair. "We are going to be a family." "We are already a family," Sarah corrected and felt him nod against her. The pregnancy progressed through the winter and into spring. Patrick was absurdly protective, barely letting Sarah lift anything heavier than a cooking pot, insisting she rest frequently, bringing her little treats and making sure she ate properly. Sarah endured his hovering with patient amusement, touched by how much he cared. When her belly began to swell with the growing child, Patrick would rest his hand there in the evenings, feeling for the baby's movements. The first time he felt a kick, his expression was one of such wonder that Sarah fell in love with him all over again. "I felt that," he said, his voice hushed with awe. "Our baby is in there moving around. That is amazing." Sarah covered his hand with hers. "You are going to be a wonderful father." "I hope so," Patrick said seriously. "I want to give this child everything I can. Love, safety, a sense of their own worth. I want them to grow up knowing they are valued the way you should have been valued all along." In late summer, with the meadow flowers blooming wild and bright around the cabin, Sarah went into labor. Patrick had brought a midwife from a neighboring homestead to stay with them as Sarah's time approached, and the woman proved her worth that day, calmly guiding Sarah through the hours of pain while Patrick paced outside, too anxious to sit still. Finally, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, a baby's cry split the air. Patrick burst through the door to find Sarah exhausted but beaming, holding a squirming, red-faced infant in her arms. "A boy," the midwife announced with a smile. "Healthy lungs on him too, as you can hear." Patrick approached slowly, like he was afraid he might break something, and knelt beside the bed. Sarah pulled back the blanket so he could see their son's scrunched-up face, the tiny fists waving in the air, the shock of dark hair on his head. "He is perfect," Patrick breathed, reaching out one large finger for the baby to grab onto. "Sarah Jane, he is perfect." "What should we name him?" Sarah asked. They had discussed names over the winter but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at their son, Patrick said, "James. James Robert Irwin, after both our fathers." Sarah thought of her own father who had died too young but had loved her fiercely in the years they had together. The name felt right. "James," she agreed softly. "Hello, James. Welcome to the world." Those first weeks with a newborn were exhausting and chaotic and utterly wonderful. Sarah had never been around babies much and felt like she was learning everything from scratch. But Patrick was right there with her, changing nappies and walking the floor with James when he fussed, and learning along with her. They were a team, partners in this adventure just like they had been partners in everything else. As James grew, the cabin filled with new sounds, gurgling laughs and babbling conversation attempts, and eventually first words. Patrick was absurdly proud when James's first word was Dada, though he made sure to spend extra time pointing to Sarah and saying Mama. Until James mastered that one too, time flowed on. James learned to walk, then to run, charging around the clearing on chubby toddler legs while Patrick pretended to chase him and Sarah laughed at their antics. They added a daughter 2 years later, a girl they named Emma Grace, who had her mother's brown hair and her father's gray eyes. And then, 3 years after that, another son they called Thomas. The cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family, Patrick building on an additional room for the children to sleep in. The vegetable garden grew larger. Patrick taught James to fish and trap, Emma to identify plants and track animals, Thomas to be brave even when he was scared. Sarah taught them all to read and write, using her mother's Bible and whatever books they could acquire on trips to town, and filled their heads with stories and songs. On summer evenings, the family would sit outside and watch the sun set over the mountains. Patrick would have his arm around Sarah, and she would lean into his solid warmth, and the children would play at their feet, and Sarah would think about how far she had come from that frightened girl scrubbing steps with her head down. One such evening when James was 10, Emma was 8, and Thomas was 5, James asked a question that had clearly been on his mind. "Mama, why do you and Papa always tell us to look people in the eye when we talk to them?" Sarah and Patrick exchanged a glance. They had never hidden Sarah's past from their children, had explained in age-appropriate ways that she had not always been as confident as she was now. But James was old enough now for more details, and his siblings listened with wide-eyed attention as Sarah told them about her time in Willits, about Uncle Robert, about how she used to keep her head down because she had been taught that she did not matter. "But then your father came along," Sarah said, reaching over to take Patrick's hand, "and he refused to let me stay invisible. He made me look up. He made me see my own worth. He saved me in every way a person can be saved." "That is not quite true," Patrick interjected quietly. "You saved yourself, Sarah Jane. I just reminded you that you could." "We saved each other then," Sarah amended with a smile. "How about that?" James considered this seriously. "I am glad Papa found you," he said finally, "because otherwise we would not be here." "I am glad too," Emma chimed in, crawling into Sarah's lap even though she was really getting too big for it. "I like our family." "Me too," Thomas added, not wanting to be left out. Patrick pulled them all close, his long arms reaching around all 3 children and Sarah, creating a circle of warmth and safety. "I am the luckiest man in these mountains," he said. "I have a wife I love more than anything and 3 children who make me proud every single day. What more could any man want?" Sarah looked around at her family, at the life they had built together in this remote mountain clearing, and felt a contentment so profound it was almost overwhelming. She thought about the girl she had been, scared and silent, convinced she was worthless. That girl would never have believed she could have this. A home full of love and laughter, children who were growing up confident and strong, a husband who cherished her and showed her every day that she mattered. Years continued to pass. The children grew into young adults, strong and capable and kind, shaped by parents who had made sure they knew their worth from the beginning. James became a skilled hunter and trapper like his father, but with a gentle soul that made him popular in the town where he eventually settled. Emma surprised everyone by becoming a teacher, opening a small school in Willits where she taught children to read and write, insisting that education was the key to knowing one's own worth. Thomas, the youngest, had a gift with animals and ended up working with horses, breaking and training them with remarkable patience. Patrick and Sarah grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies showing the marks of years of hard work. But Patrick's eyes still lit up when Sarah walked into a room, and Sarah still felt her heart skip when Patrick pulled her close. The love that had started with a mountain man refusing to let a broken girl stay invisible had only deepened and strengthened over the decades. One autumn afternoon, when they were both well into their 60s, Sarah and Patrick sat on the porch of their cabin, wrapped in a quilt against the cool mountain air. Their grandchildren were playing in the clearing, James's 2 sons and Emma's daughter, and Thomas would be arriving with his wife and new baby the next day for a visit. "You ever regret it?" Patrick asked suddenly. "Marrying me and coming up here to live this hard life? You could have had an easier path." Sarah looked at him in genuine surprise. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. Patrick, you gave me a life, a real life full of love and purpose and joy. How could I ever regret that? I just worry sometimes that I took you from the world, kept you isolated up here on this mountain." "You did not take me from anything," Sarah said, reaching up to cup his bearded face in her hand. "You gave me everything. You taught me to lift my chin and look at the world directly. You showed me that I was worth something. You loved me when I did not know how to love myself. Because of you, I became the woman I was always meant to be. And together, we built something beautiful. Look at them." She gestured to their grandchildren, laughing and playing in the golden afternoon light. "Look at what we made. Children and grandchildren who are confident and kind and strong, who know their worth because we made sure to teach them. That is your legacy, Patrick Irwin. That is our legacy together." Patrick pulled her close, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower over the mountains they had called home for so long. After a while, Patrick said quietly, "I saw you that first day, before I came to the store. I saw you kneeling there scrubbing those steps, and something in my chest just ached. I knew I had to make you look up. I had to see your eyes. And when you finally did look at me, when I saw all that strength and beauty and potential you were hiding, I was lost." "I am glad you were stubborn," Sarah said with a smile. "I am glad you refused to let me stay invisible." "I am glad you were brave enough to look up," Patrick countered, "and to keep looking up every day since." They sat together as the sun set. 2 people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life and a family in the wild beauty of the California mountains, who had taught each other what love really meant. Sarah thought back to that scared girl on the steps, who never looked up because she believed she had nothing worth seeing, and silently thanked that mountain man who had refused to accept her invisibility, who had lifted her chin and made sure she saw her own worth clearly. The sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and Sarah leaned into Patrick's warmth, grateful for every moment, every memory, every day they had shared. Their story had started with a simple act of kindness, a stranger refusing to let a broken girl stay broken, and it had blossomed into a lifetime of love. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The seasons turned and the years rolled forward. Patrick and Sarah watched their grandchildren grow, welcomed more as each of their children added to the family, and eventually great-grandchildren began to arrive. The cabin in the mountains remained their home, though their children had built their own lives in various places throughout California. Winter arrived with particular force the year Patrick turned 73 and Sarah 70. The snow fell heavy and deep, more than they had seen in years, and Patrick spent long days clearing paths and making sure the cabin was secure against the cold. Sarah worried about him, about the way he moved a little slower these days, about how the cold seemed to settle in his joints, but Patrick waved off her concerns with his usual stubbornness. "I have been living on this mountain for 50 years, he reminded her. "A little snow is not going to stop me now." They settled in for the winter, content in each other's company as they had been for all these decades. On particularly cold nights, they would lie together under piles of quilts, many of them made by Sarah's own hands over the years, and talk about their life together. They remembered the day they met, their midnight flight to get married, the births of their children, the hundreds of small moments that had woven together to create their shared history. "I would do it all again," Patrick said one night, his arm around Sarah as she rested her head on his chest. "Every single moment exactly the same. Even the hard parts?" Sarah asked. "Especially the hard parts," Patrick said. "Because the hard parts made us who we are. They taught us to appreciate what we have, and they showed us what we are capable of when we have someone to face them with." Sarah lifted her head to kiss him, a gentle brush of lips that still sent warmth through her body after all these years. "I love you, Patrick Irwin, more now than ever. And I love you, Sarah Jane Irwin, my brave girl who learned to lift her chin and never look down again." Spring came eventually, as it always did, melting the snow and coaxing new green growth from the earth. Their children and grandchildren came to visit, filling the cabin with noise and laughter and life. Patrick delighted in teaching the youngest ones to fish in the creek, just as he had taught his own children decades before. Sarah baked bread and told stories, passing on the family history to eager young ears. On a warm afternoon in May, with wildflowers blooming across the meadow and birds singing in the trees, Sarah and Patrick took a walk together, something they had done thousands of times over the years. They moved more slowly now, their steps careful on the uneven ground, but they still held hands, their fingers intertwined with the ease of long practice. They reached their favorite spot, a flat boulder that overlooked the valley below, and sat down together. From here they could see for miles, the mountains rolling away in waves of green and gray, the sky impossibly blue above them. "It is beautiful," Sarah said, though she had said the same thing from this spot countless times before. "It is," Patrick agreed, "but not as beautiful as you." Sarah laughed and swatted his arm playfully. "You old charmer, after 50 years you still say things like that." "After 50 years they are still true," Patrick said simply. He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. "Sarah Jane, thank you." "For what?" "For saying yes. For being brave enough to take a chance on a rough mountain man you barely knew. For building this life with me. For giving me children and grandchildren and more happiness than any one man deserves. For being my partner in everything. Just thank you." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "You are going to make me cry, you impossible man." "Good tears, I hope." "The best tears," Sarah confirmed, wiping her eyes. "Patrick, I never imagined I could have a life like this. When I was kneeling on those steps in Willits, I thought that was all I would ever be. Someone small and invisible, working until I died without ever really living. And then you came along and changed everything. You saw me when no one else did. You made me see myself. Every good thing in my life came from that moment when you refused to let me keep my head down." They sat together on the boulder, watching the sun move across the sky. Two souls who had found each other and chosen each other and built something lasting and true. Eventually, the shadows grew long and they made their way back to the cabin, where the lights were glowing warm and welcoming in the gathering dusk. The years that followed were gentle ones. Patrick and Sarah settled into a peaceful old age, surrounded by family and secure in the knowledge that they had lived well and loved deeply. They had their aches and pains, their moments of forgetfulness, Their nights when the past seemed more vivid than the present, but through it all they had each other. Patrick passed first, on a quiet morning in early autumn, dying peacefully in his sleep with Sarah beside him. Sarah grieved deeply, feeling like half of herself had been torn away, but she took comfort in their children and grandchildren who gathered around her, all of them proof of the life she and Patrick had created together. She lived another 5 years without him, staying in the cabin they had built together, tended lovingly by their children who made sure she was never alone for long. She spent her days in the garden Patrick had expanded so many times, sitting on the porch where they had watched so many sunsets, and walking to that flat boulder to sit and remember. On a warm spring afternoon, with the meadow full of wildflowers just as it had been that day so long ago when she and Patrick had sat together and reminisced, Sarah closed her eyes for the last time. She went peacefully, a small smile on her face, perhaps seeing in those final moments a tall mountain man with kind gray eyes, reaching out his hand to help her up, to lift her chin, to show her that she mattered. Her children gathered to lay her to rest beside Patrick, high on the mountain they had loved, and the entire community came to pay their respects. Emma spoke at the service, telling the story of how her parents had met, how a scared girl who never looked up had been saved by a mountain man who refused to let her stay invisible. "My mother spent the rest of her life with her head held high," Emma said, her voice strong despite her tears. She looked people in the eye, spoke her mind, and never forgot her worth. And she made sure that everyone around her, especially her children and grandchildren, knew their worth too. That is the legacy she and my father left us. The knowledge that we matter, that we are seen, that we are loved. The story of Patrick and Sarah Irwin became a legend in those mountains, passed down through generations. The tale of a mountain man who saw worth in a broken girl, who refused to let her hide, who loved her so completely that she learned to love herself. And the tale of a brave young woman who took a chance on a stranger, who left everything she knew for an uncertain future, and who found in the wilderness and in one man's steady devotion a life beyond anything she had ever dreamed possible. Their cabin still stands, maintained by their descendants, a testament to what they built together. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun sets over the mountains, people say you can see two figures sitting on that flat boulder overlooking the valley, holding hands and watching the world they loved together, forever. It was a love story written in the wild West Mountains of California, a love that began with a simple act of kindness and grew into something that outlasted both their lives. Patrick had lifted Sarah's chin and made sure she saw her own worth clearly, and in doing so, he had given her everything. And she, in turn, had given him a life full of meaning and purpose and joy. It was, in the end, a story about being seen, about being valued, about finding someone who refuses to let you be invisible and choosing to trust them enough to let yourself be found. It was a story about two people who saved each other, who built something beautiful from broken pieces, who proved that love could heal even the deepest wounds. And it was a story with a happy ending, the kind where love conquers all, where two souls find each other against all odds, and where a girl who never looked up finally learns to face the world with courage, knowing that she is worthy, she is valuable, and she is deeply, endlessly loved. Their great-great-grandchildren still visit that mountain cabin, bringing their own children to see where it all began. They tell the story of Sarah Jane, who scrubbed steps with her eyes downcast, and Patrick, the mountain man who would not let her stay invisible. They talk about courage and worth and the transformative power of love. And they make sure that every child knows they matter, that they are seen, that they are valued, carrying forward the legacy that Patrick and Sarah began all those years ago. The world moves on, times change, but love like theirs, deep and true and lasting, leaves a mark that never fades. It was a story that began with one man refusing to accept that another human being could be invisible, and it ended with a family that stretched across generations, all of them carrying forward the lesson that Patrick taught Sarah on those steps so long ago. That every person has worth. That everyone deserves to be seen. That we all matter, even when the world tries to tell us otherwise. And perhaps that is the greatest love story of all. Not just the romance between two people, though Patrick and Sarah's love was real and deep and beautiful. But the larger story of how love can change us, how it can teach us to see ourselves differently, how it can give us the courage to lift our heads and face the world with confidence. Sarah Jane had been a girl who never looked up, who moved through life trying to be invisible, convinced that she did not matter. Patrick had been a lonely mountain man who saw someone hurting and refused to walk away. Together, they created something magical. A love that healed wounds, a family that flourished, a legacy that endured. And in the end, is that not what we all hope for? To be seen, to be valued, to matter to someone. To find that person who will lift our chin when we forget to lift it ourselves, who will remind us of our worth when we forget, who will love us through the hard times and celebrate with us in the good times. Patrick and Sarah found that in each other, high in the California mountains, in a life that was hard but rewarding, simple but rich, quiet but full of love. They proved that you do not need wealth or status or worldly success to have a meaningful life. You just need love, real love, the kind that sees past the surface to the truth underneath, the kind of love that refuses to let someone stay invisible, the kind of love that lifts chins and opens eyes and changes everything. The kind of love that lasts forever, echoing through generations, touching lives that have not even been born yet. That was Patrick and Sarah's gift to the world. That was their story. And it was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down through the ages as a reminder that love, true love, can save us all. In the wild west mountains of California, where the redwoods touch the sky and the creeks run cold and clear, where wildflowers bloom in impossible abundance every spring, the legend lives on. The legend of a mountain man and the girl who never looked up, and how together they learned to see the world and each other and themselves clearly. And they lived happily ever after, in every way that matters, building a legacy of love that will never be forgotten.